So one of the things we talk about quite a bit here at Pondering Politics is the fact, and indeed it is a fact, that there is an asymmetry of expectation which plagues the Democratic Party and benefits the Republican Party. And it's an asymmetry which is perpetuated by pretty much everybody. The media, the electorate, we all have contributed to it in one form or another, and it has to stop. And so I'm very happy when much more influential and established commentators address the issue, because I don't think it's talked about nearly enough. And so for that reason, I was very pleased when MSNBC commentator Chris Hayes actually had a guest on his show to talk about it at length. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Okay, so we're heading into an election year. The polls are uncomfortably tight between Democrats and Republicans and President Biden and Donald Trump, despite the fact that Donald Trump is a fascist. And I'm not ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater, even though I know some people are. I do think that the polls may not be necessarily predictive, but they do show a snapshot in time that we have to pay attention to. We must heed them and consider things accordingly. But Chris Hayes had a guy named David Roberts on to address this asymmetry of expectation, which you've heard me complain about time and time again, because it makes the electoral challenge of the Democratic Party and the ideological policy challenge of the progressive left in general much, much harder. And it's challenging already, but this asymmetry only makes a very difficult job that much harder. So I want to play this clip, and we'll unpack it together.
Next year will be an even more explicit referendum on the future of American democracy. And yet, there's this maddening set of rhetorical incentives driving all different factions of the American electorate and institutions and media to criticize the person representing the pro-democracy forces in that referendum, President Joe Biden. As writer David Roberts puts it, quote, "There is no faction in U.S. politics, barely even elected Democrats, for whom praising Democrats is socially advantageous. It is, from almost every vantage point, uncool. Just try it on Twitter to see for yourself." Joining me now is David Roberts, author of the fantastic Volts newsletter, host of the Volts podcast, which is about clean energy and politics. David, I thought your thread the other day was fascinating about the rhetorical incentives that a whole variety of factions, ostensibly on the center left or in the establishment of American life, have towards their views of the current incumbent American president and what to say about him. Run me through your argument.
Yeah, this has been striking me for years, and it's only gotten more acute lately, I think. Obviously, anytime you watch right-wing media, Republican media, it's wall-to-wall criticism of Democrats, even more so than praise of Republicans. Humanizing Democrats has been the core of Fox's reason for being since it was born. And then you have the left, the sort of far left, the progressives, who, for good reasons, I think, want to move the Dems left and want the Dems to be more ambitious, and so are constantly criticizing Dems from the left, to the point that it's become kind of a rigid habit that they do regardless, no matter what happens. And then you have these sort of thoughtful centrist Dem pundits, all of whom need to show the other thoughtful centrist Dem pundits how independent they are, the fact they're not partisans, they're not team players, they're thinking for themselves. And the way to do that is by criticizing their own party. And so if you go down the list, you'll notice there's no one left who actually just wants to go tell voters what Democrats have accomplished, what Dems are doing, who wants to actually be partisan for Democrats. It's a weird thing that there's one of two political parties that has effectively very little spokespeople in the media. Everyone has incentive to criticize them. No one has the incentive to defend them.
David Roberts is 100% correct. Again, you've heard me rail about this before. We're going to go through his very short Twitter thread, which was the subject of that particular exchange between Chris Hayes and Roberts himself. And then again, we'll unpack it. So he says, if you're on the right, shitting on Dems is how you demonstrate the shared hatreds which make you part of the tribe. If you're on the center left, shitting on Democrats is how you demonstrate the above-it-all independence that earns you the admiration of peers. If you're on the left, shitting on Dems is how you demonstrate the moral and ideological purity that are the price of membership. If you're in the media, shitting on Dems is how you fight off accusations of bias and establish your objectivity. There is no faction in U.S. politics, barely even elected Dems, for whom praising Dems is socially advantageous. There's no approbation weighting, no repetitional boost for anyone. It is, from almost every vantage point, uncool. Just try it on Twitter and see for yourself. Thus, we get today's information environment, which responds to a transition from 4 years of violent, irrational madness and mass death to 3 years of relative scandal-free sanity and economic recovery with unrelenting top-to-bottom negativity. No faction, as far as I can tell, not a single individual, wants to reckon with their role and responsibility in the state of affairs. So I guess we're going to talk ourselves into outright fascism, and it's going to be no one's fault. Scream internally. I couldn't have said it better myself. The last thing I'll say before, again, we unpack it is there was an NBC poll which dropped on Sunday, and the top line, of course, was bad news for Biden, great news for Trump, et cetera, and so forth. The thing I want to focus on, though, is looking ahead to the 2024 congressional elections. 47%, according to this poll, of registered voters say they prefer a Republican-controlled Congress versus 45% who want Democrats in charge. Back in September's poll, voters were split, 46 Democratic, 45 Republican on this question. So it's actually seen Republicans gain traction in terms of whom voters would prefer to have in power. This is after months of speaker drama, the government shutdown, elected Republicans themselves openly screaming on the floor of the House of Representatives that their party can't get anything done. And yet, a slightly greater number of voters would prefer them to be in charge than Democrats. Folks, this is what I'm talking about when I refer to the asymmetry of expectation. This is a manifestation of it. And like David Roberts, I mean, I do consider myself on the progressive left. I'm sure I'm nowhere near as progressive as many others would say, but I do consider myself. I am a fan of Bernie Sanders. I am a fan of the Squad and AOC and the Progressive Caucus. And as I've said repeatedly, one of the things that I like about President Biden's administration is that he has been amenable to pressure from the progressive left. I mean, the fact that he was able to form, after he won the primary back in 2020, Joe Biden worked very closely with Bernie Sanders to form a relatively progressive caucus. And it was one of the reasons, or it's a huge reason, why I think, perhaps the only reason, that President Biden's administration has been so relatively progressive compared to Obama, Clinton, and basically every other Democratic president, at least since LBJ, if not FDR. I don't think Joe Biden would govern necessarily that progressively if left to his own devices. So he is just susceptible to pressure from the left. So I think it's good for the progressive left to keep pressuring President Biden and Democrats very thoughtfully, very carefully. But I do agree that they shouldn't just settle for what they've been given. But I also think, as David Roberts points out, especially as we head into an election year, we have to reframe the narrative. It can't just be that we always demand more without also acknowledging the meaningful gains for the American people that have been gotten along the way. They're not mutually exclusive. They can't be mutually exclusive. We can simultaneously say, hey, look, when it comes to President Biden's progressive bona fides, his National Labor Relations Board, his pro-union position, the sweeping legislation with respect to the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package, the CHIPS Act, the PACT Act, et cetera, and so forth, that Joe Biden has been a very legislatively successful president, especially under the circumstances, and there have been meaningful gains. The Respect for Marriage Act, which will enshrine marriage protections in the event that this rogue Supreme Court overturns gay marriage protections, et cetera, and so forth. We have to acknowledge those things. We have to remind ourselves and others of those things. That way people, when it comes time to vote or to be politically engaged, they don't think it's for nothing. We can actually prove, listen, if you vote, if you stay engaged, you can, do things that will have a materially beneficial outcome for progressive left values. And yet, we're not done. We can't be done. There's much more to be done, and we have to keep putting pressure. We have to make it so that it's okay to grade, not only okay, the default, it is necessary to grade Republicans and Democrats by the same standard. There's no reason to have this asymmetry of expectation. Again, David Roberts goes through the examples. He says, listen, right-wingers obviously are going to grade Republicans on a curve because they're ideologically incentivized to do so. Progressives are going to hold Democrats to a higher standard for much more sympathetic and understandable and good faith reasons, but they too should acknowledge the meaningful gains. And then you have the elements of the mainstream media, centrists and independents, who are like, listen, we have to show how independent we are by basically downplaying, minimizing, or just refusing to acknowledge outright the vast, considerable, meaningful differences between Biden and Trump, Democrats and Republicans. It has to stop. We have to stop it. You and I I'm sure, if we're being very honest and very, very reflective, have contributed to that asymmetry in one form or another. And here at this channel, one of the things that we're trying to do is undermine it. We have to say, no, no, no. We have to hold everybody to the same standard. And if that means we hold everybody to the same standard, and in the end, we find that Joe Biden, for all his faults, is vastly superior in all meaningful ways than Donald Trump, then no matter if that offends your centrist, independent sensibilities, if that's what the facts show, and the facts do indeed show that, then we should be okay discussing it. It should be permissible, acceptable, and not at all reprehensible or socially costly to acknowledge that fact. We have to kill this instinct for false equivalence and double standards, because all it's doing is making meaningful progress that much harder to attain. Okay, that's why I said in a video a couple of months ago, it's not only okay to be partisan, it's actually socially responsible, morally responsible to be progressively partisan in today's political climate. I don't think it's possible to be a good faith, informed, nonpartisan. And if you're a good faith partisan, then you will have a partisan bent towards the left. Politically, you will have a partisan bent towards the Democratic Party. And we have to make it acceptable for that fact to be, broadcast to the world. So I like that Chris Hayes talked about it. I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, and I'm sure in aggregate I will. But let me know what you think in the comments.